We are honored today to be hosting a panel featuring Josh Ruebner and Matthew Reynolds. Josh Ruebner is the National Advocacy Director at the U.S. Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation. Mr. Ruebner is a former analyst in the Middle East Affairs at the Congressional Research Service. His analysis and commentary on the U.S. policy toward the Middle East appears frequently in media such as NBC, ABC Nightline, C-SPAN, and Al Jazeera. Mr. Ruebner is joined by Matthew Reynolds, the head representative of the United Nations Relief and Work Agency in Washington, D.C. Mr. Reynolds began his career on Capitol Hill in 1986. After 17 years in Congress, Mr. Reynolds moved to the Department of State as Director of House Affairs. In 2005, he started with the Bureau of Legislative Affairs and was appointed Assistant Secretary for State for Legislative Affairs in 2008. For those of you who are watching our live webcast, you can send your questions and comments to the panel while watching online by tweeting to @PalestineCenter. You can also participate via Facebook in our live chat roll. I ask that everyone please silence their cell phones for the duration of this lecture. We will now begin the lecture and follow with a question-and-answer session. Thank you.
What I thought I'd do originally is just give a very tiny 30-second brief overview of UNRWA. A lot of you may not be familiar with what UNRWA does or how important it is in the region. And we brought with us one or two quick little, everybody needs a handout, a quick little handout about UNRWA and some frequently asked questions about the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East. You know, UNRWA became operational in May of 1950 as the successor to the short-lived UN Relief for Palestine Refugees Agency, which was established in 1948, created by the General Assembly. UNRWA is the only agency that deals specifically with Palestinian refugees, and its only mission is to assess the 4.7 million registered Palestine refugees. We provide protection and care. So in a way, we're the other refugee agency. Everyone always thinks of UNHCR, so we're the other refugee agency. We actually were created first. UNRWA, in its name, as you see, has relief and works. So the two principal components are relief, which is pretty self-explanatory. That includes food aid and shelter and emergencies, and educational services and so on. And then we also provide works, and the works is to create opportunities for refugees to become self-reliant and to become productive members of their communities. And this would include programs of job creation, programs of job training, vocational training, education, as well as microfinance. UNRWA operates in 5 fields, and only 5 fields: Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and the occupied Palestinian territories. That's the West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem. 29% of all refugees live in the 58 refugee camps. UNRWA operates 691 schools, 137 primary health care centers, and employs 30,000 people as staff, most of whom are Palestine refugees themselves. The budget is almost $1 billion. It's comprised almost exclusively of all voluntary contributions. There's a small portion that comes from the UN for international staff, but the rest are countries voluntarily donating. So it's not an automatic check every year. We have to go ask countries to support UNRWA. And for those of you here in the United States, you should be proud to know that 1/4 of all of UNRWA's donations come from the United States government. So it's 1/4 of the budget. In fairness to our European friends, the EU is the other quarter. And then there's a number of others in between. UNRWA isn't a political agency. So the status and the future of the refugee issue, including the right to return, which is part of a final status, is to be determined by the political negotiators involved and by the parties, not by UNRWA. We're a humanitarian organization, and sometimes there are entities in the United States and others who would like us to be political, much more political, and there are others, of course, who think we already are political. So in reality, we are not. We are neither. Now let's take a quick look at a snapshot of UNRWA in Gaza, because today's talk is about Gaza. Gaza, as you may know, is the Gaza Strip area, has 1.5 million people, and roughly 3/4, or 1.1 million, are registered refugees. And they all live within a 360 square kilometer area. However, 35% of that area is off limits. That's an Israeli-defined security zone, which is about 300 meters in from all the borders, which is at least 3 football fields. So that's a lot of territory, including farmland and others, that's basically inaccessible. So it's a little squished, a little tighter. 514 million of those people live in 8 camps. I'm not going to name them all, but if you want to know them, you can ask me afterwards. But you've probably heard of some of the larger camps there. There's Rafah and Gaza Beach and Khan Yunis and so on. In Gaza, the UNRWA has 10,000 staff, so we employ 10,000 Palestinians in UNRWA with over 275 installations. And one of the things you may see in the frequently asked questions is a misconception that's out there is that UNRWA doesn't run the Palestinian camps. The actual camps are run by the host governments and the political and administrative control as well as security control are done by others. UNRWA only has facilities like schools and health centers in the camps. We have in Gaza 228 schools with 206,000 pupils. And I got to tell you, having just been in Gaza a month and a half ago and visited a number of the schools, they're very excited and energetic kids. There is a real future there in these kids if they can move on. Unfortunately, 90% of our schools operate with double shifts. We just have more kids than facilities available. We have 20 primary health centers, and there are 10 food distribution centers. And you may ask, why is there still food distribution? Unfortunately, in 2010, 850,000 people received nearly 64,000 tons of food delivered over 4 distribution periods during the year. So that's about half of the population is receiving food assistance, is eligible and receiving food assistance from UNRWA. That's only the refugee population. The World Food Program also provides food assistance to quite a few of the other Gazans who were not refugees. These are people who would have been in Gaza prior to 1948. Also in 2010, over $6 million in cash grants were provided to 200,000 of the most vulnerable individuals. As you can see, Gaza is not really a wealthy place. We provide temporary shelter to 42,000 individuals, as over 60,000 homes were damaged and destroyed in 2008 during Cast Lead. 325,000 refugees live in abject poverty, and they're eligible for double rations of food. I mean, this is the poorest of the poor. And another 350,000 live below the official poverty level. In 2010, again, nearly 78,000 adult refugees and their 550,000 dependents benefit from UNRWA job creation programs. And while job creation programs are certainly helpful for the employment and prosperity in Gaza, frankly, they're not the biggest part of the answer. The biggest part of the answer to alleviating the crisis is simply to enable to have more jobs and more prosperity is really, it is 100% dependent on lifting of the blockade. For the last 4 years, UNRWA has declared quite unequivocally that the blockade must be lifted. And while we welcomed in mid-2010 the government of Israel's decision to ease the blockade by improving access for a variety of consumer goods and some construction materials for a tightly controlled number of internationally funded and supervised projects, the situation remains, however, unsustainable as the blockade still hampers our ability, and it's UNRWA's ability, to carry out reconstruction projects with urgency that's required. And I'll have a little bit more on that in just a moment. More importantly, the blockade has, as you know, has almost wholly isolated Gaza from the outside world, caused dramatic deterioration of public services and infrastructure, suffocated its formal economy, and given birth to one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. And for those of you who would like to know more of these, it was covered in quite a bit of the international media, including the Wall Street Journal and others, is UNRWA has somewhere in here, I'll show you. We put out the economic and sort of economy and the unemployment and employment stats for Gaza as well as for the West Bank. And it shows that while there's been some improvements in some places, you will find that most of the job creation was related to the working with aid and aid input. It was not from real sustainable export or created jobs that way. It's the population, most of which almost half is the youth under the age of 18, has been forced into a dangerous indignity of dependence on humanitarian aid. And as I mentioned, aid dependency is over 80% in Gaza today. So there really are better alternatives, such as reviving Gaza's export markets. But again, they're dependent on a genuine lifting of the blockade. So that brings us to the blockade and, if you will, the crossings. What may be different from some other speakers and other things you read and groups you work with, UNRWA only uses the official Israeli-controlled crossings. We work closely with the government of Israel on in a number of areas, Gaza and the West Bank being 2 of them, and we, as I said, we only use those crossings. Today, that means there's only 2 crossings that are available. The Eretz crossing, which is really for UNRWA staff, internationals like myself when I went to Gaza to cross. And the Kerem Shalom crossing, which is probably Eretz being in the furthest north, right, convenient, and Kerem Shalom being the furthest corner of the south that you could find in the Gaza Strip, with a very small road that until recently wasn't really even paved. So perhaps one of the most inconvenient. There are certainly other crossings. Unfortunately, they happen to be closed, and they could be very helpful if they were open, including Karni and Sofa and Nahal Oz. They're designed, they're ready, they were open at one point, and they could be reopened. UNRWA does not utilize the tunnel economy, and there has been a lot of growth, and I think some have attributed some of the growth and some of the new construction in Gaza to prosperity that's happening, but frankly a lot of that is related to the tunnel economy, which is an informal and unofficial economy. Therefore, we as UNRWA are completely dependent on the Kerem Shalom crossing, which is woefully insufficient. And here's why. Let me give you just an insight. I was speaking previously about some of the construction needs. We have a large program, a $660 million program, to build needed shelter and schools. I just commented on how many young people there were, and the schools are double-shipped, and we need and have plans for 100 new schools. Only 42 of those 100 needed schools have received approval from the Israeli authorities for construction. And we've only received approval for 1,413 shelters, only 14% of what we are planning to build, and this is for individuals who've lost their homes due to cast lead and the security zone. So to complete the 73 projects approved to date, we need about 17,000 truckloads of construction material. And again, it has to come through Kerem Shalom. We're not using any of the unofficial and illegal tunnels. So assuming UNRWA will use its share and we get 60% of the current Shalom crossing capacity for construction supplies, it would take 1 full year to get the materials for only those current projects approved. And that's roughly about, right now it's at a rate of 100 trucks a day. There's about 250 a day that cross. UNRWA would take 100 of those. It's the unofficial ceiling at Kerem Shalom is 300 trucks, even though it has a capacity for 450. Now, if you open up some of those other crossings, even if it's just for international groups like UNRWA, it's SOFA or Karni, you could add another 250 trucks or 10,000 tons a day of material that would speed up the construction of these schools and of the housing. We're working on it. It's a long and laborious process. An interesting side effect of that is the result of this is that actually the price of aggregate of the construction materials and cement and so on for UNRWA is actually up 10 to 15%. So think about that when we're looking for donations and voluntary donations from abroad. Part of our cost now, unfortunately, is because of the cost of using this one crossing, whereas because of the local tunnels, the individuals who use tunnel economy, actually the price of their aggregate has dropped from $88 a ton down to $36 a ton. So there are questions sometimes, and UNRWA runs into challenges sometimes where individuals find that they're finding their own homes being built or homes being built privately faster than what UNRWA's been promising, and it does lead to sometimes sensitivities and problems with some of our refugees who are anxious to move into a new home. That brings us to the Rafah Crossing, which I know is part of today's discussion. As you know, the crossing at Rafah is governed by international agreements involving Egypt and Israel. And UNRWA, as I explained, we really only use the Eretz and Kerem Shalom crossing. We did see an initial surge right after the change occurred in Rafah. And however, that's been replaced essentially by the former numbers that are there. For example, just yesterday, 465 persons entered Gaza, 478 persons crossed into Egypt, and 9 persons were denied entry into Egypt. That's all that crossed out of Gaza, with the exception, of course, of special cases and internationals that go through Eretz, but that's a separate category. So that's where the Rafah crossing numbers and so on are today. I know that with that, others, may be able to comment, or you may have questions about why the change, or what the capacity of Rafah is, what the impact of unilateral Egyptian changes to Rafah Crossing has on bilateral relations with Israel, maybe the impact of Gaza's connections with the West Bank, especially economically, and how that affects the political bonds between Palestinians and Gaza and the West Bank, the impact of greater opening of Rafah would have on exports as well as imports, and how that may change Gaza's industries and orientations and old businesses. It's interesting, Gaza has been linked for so very long with Israel. The interesting factors, people forget that the main currency that you use in Gaza is the Israeli shekel. So it's how Rafah and other crossings issues relate to future flotilla activities. These are all questions you may have. I may not be able. I'm going to defer some of those to my colleague here, because as a UN agency and a non-political agency, we don't get into the politics of our member states and other people. And similarly, with the flotilla, I guess our only comments, and the Secretary General has made pretty straightforward comments on it. But for us, I think for UNRWA, our point has always been, if you open the blockade and you open the crossings, that's going to really answer the questions that are out there, whether you're in favor of a flotilla or opposed to a flotilla. At the end of the day, a flotilla, there's no need for any of this if we have a lifting of the blockade and we're able to bring in our materials, and others are able to bring in consumer materials without a lot of interruption. In fact, an interesting item, and just to show the support of UNRWA, where we're often sometimes criticized as if you go to the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces website, and you want to find ways, what they consider safe and proper ways to give contributions to the Palestinians in Gaza, they recommend two websites to go to: the Red Cross and UNRWA. So that's where we are, and that's sort of a quick overview, and you may want to take on from there.
Well, thank you so much to the Palestine Center and Jerusalem Fund for inviting me here today, and thanks especially to the summer interns and Alexandra especially for putting together this series of speeches. It's really an honor for me to be back here again speaking to you today. My name is Josh Ruebner. I'm the National Advocacy Director of the U.S. Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation. We are a national coalition of more than 350 U.S.-based organizations working to challenge our government's current policy towards Palestine and Israel and end U.S. support for Israeli occupation and apartheid in favor of a policy that supports human rights, international law, and equality for everyone. And the Palestine Center is one of our very original members of our coalition from when we were founded back in 2002. What I'd like to do today briefly is speak to you about U.S. policy towards the greater opening of the Rafah border crossing with Egypt, but also speak more broadly about U.S. policy towards Israel's blockade on Gaza and efforts to break that blockade. And finally, to look at how, if at all, the United States is holding Israel accountable for its actions towards Gaza and indeed to its own laws and policies itself. Now, on the issue of the border crossing with Rafah, there has been somewhat opening, as Matt described, that was done in May with the new Egyptian transition regime that's in place. And the U.S. has had a pretty consistent but ambiguous response to this development. There's been several statements from the State Department. I won't read all of them because they're very similar, but I'll give you a typical one to give you an idea of what the reaction has been. On April 29th, State Department spokesperson Jake Sullivan was asked about U.S. opinions on the reopening of the border crossing, and he said, quote, "We have long supported efforts to meet the humanitarian needs of the Palestinian people in Gaza, but at the same time we have been clear that efforts to do that have to ensure that the transfer of weapons and other material and financial support is blocked. And we have worked with and will continue to work with Egypt and our allies in the region to be able to achieve this." So you can see that it's not exactly a ringing endorsement of the opening of the Rafah border crossing, but it's not also a condemnation of it either. But I think in this statement, and the other State Department ones have been very similar to this, as I mentioned, you see how U.S. policy towards the border crossing at Rafah really shades into and can't be disentangled from U.S. policy towards Israel's blockade of the Gaza Strip. Because what you see in the State Department statement is that the Gaza Strip is only a problem vis-a-vis humanitarian needs. If the minimal humanitarian needs of the people of Gaza are being met through the various mechanisms that exist, that's fine with the United States. That's all the pressure it believes it should put on Israel to make the situation tenable. And of course, we know from documents that have been revealed in a case where an Israeli human rights organization sued the Israeli military to make these documents available, that Israel has calculated on a very precise basis exactly how many trucks of goods it will take to keep Gaza's population just above the starvation point. And as Israel's former Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon, his top advisor, Dov Weissglass, said right before Israel's unilateral withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, that the idea behind removing settlements and removing soldiers from within the Gaza Strip is to put Palestinians, quote, on a diet. So this is part of a very deliberate policy, not to have starving Palestinians, but to keep Palestinians right on the brink of starvation. So as long as that's happening, as long as there are no pictures that resemble what is today happening in Somalia coming out of Gaza, then that's quite fine with the State Department. So therefore, there's a certain logic to U.S. policy on this, because if Gaza is only a humanitarian issue, and if it's being managed to the extent to which no one is actually starving to death, but just barely above the starvation level, then there's nothing wrong with Israel's blockade of the Gaza Strip in this reasoning. So that therefore, if you extend the logic a little bit further, any efforts to challenge or to break Israel's blockade of the Gaza Strip should also be opposed. What I'd like to do is quote quite extensively, actually, because I think it's a very dramatic and very scary and very upsetting statement from the State Department issued on June 24th of this year in regards to the flotilla, which we now know has been completely neutralized. This is Victoria Nuland speaking on June 24th. And I'm probably going to stop and interject my own comments, both because it's long and because Victoria Nuland's comments scream for some analysis, corrective analysis. We are concerned, Victoria Nuland says, that a number of groups are organizing a one-year anniversary flotilla to commemorate the incident by sailing from various European ports to Gaza in the near future. Groups that seek to break Israel's maritime blockade of Gaza are taking irresponsible and provocative actions that risk the safety of their passengers. So what's irresponsible and provocative is not Israel's collective punishment. It's not Israel's illegal blockade of the Gaza Strip. This is me speaking, by the way, not the State Department. But the very act of civil society challenging that blockade. Back to Ms. Nuland. Established and efficient mechanisms exist to transfer humanitarian assistance to Gaza, as Matt outlined. Now here, again, is another problem in conceptualizing civil society efforts to break Israel's blockade of Gaza. The flotilla to Gaza was never about delivering humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. It was a political act of solidarity and a way for international civil society to express their disagreement with Israel's illegal blockade of the Gaza Strip and to demonstrate its willingness to try to break that illegal blockade so that the people of Gaza would be free to welcome visitors to their territory. So you see, the flotilla was framed in a humanitarian perspective, which was not at all true. Back to Victoria Nuland's statement. For example, humanitarian assistance can be delivered at the Israeli port of Ashdod, where cargo can be offloaded, inspected, and transported to Gaza. We urge all those seeking to provide such assistance to the people of Gaza to use these mechanisms and not participate in actions like the planned flotilla. She also goes on to note that humanitarian conditions in the Gaza Strip are improving, which are actually true. But let's step back and ask ourselves why those humanitarian conditions may be getting a little bit better, may be creeping up a little bit above the starvation levels that Israel calculates so precisely. It's precisely because international civil society has tried repeatedly to break Israel's illegal blockade of Gaza and the actions that Israel has taken in response by attacking the original flotilla last year that resulted in so much negative publicity both for Israel and for its blockade of the Gaza Strip, that has really forced them, as Matt noted, to ease up slightly on the blockade and now to allow certain limited construction materials into the Gaza Strip. This is not a result of the U.S. pressuring Israel on an official level, and not the UN pressuring Israel. It's the result of civil society demanding, through actions like the flotilla, that Israel end its illegal blockade. Victoria Nuland ended her statement on a very disturbing note. She said, "We underscore that delivering or attempting or conspiring to deliver material support or other resources to or for the benefit of a designated foreign terrorist organization, such as Hamas, could violate U.S. civil and criminal statutes and could lead to fines and incarcerations." So here you have the truly ludicrous situation of the U.S. government standing not with its citizens who are engaging in peaceful protest and exercising their peaceful, legitimate rights of freedom of political expression, and attempting to deliver not humanitarian aid, not any form of material support to Hamas, but letters of solidarity from ordinary individual Americans to the people of Gaza saying, we don't agree with our government's support for Israel's blockade of Gaza. The State Department had the audacity to threaten those U.S. citizens and to say that they could be subjected to fines and imprisonment under the terms of the Patriot Act and the Supreme Court's decision on Holder v. Humanitarian Law Project that says that even if you're just providing human rights training and someone in the audience happens to be from an organization that the U.S. considers to be a terrorist organization, that you've provided material support. So apparently in the twisted logic of the Obama administration, it's more important to threaten U.S. citizens taking actions to block Israel's illegal blockade than it is to actually end Israel's illegal blockade of Gaza. And as we know, the U.S. has conspired with Israel to block the flotilla from happening by putting immense pressure on Greece to prevent the Audacity of Hope, which was the U.S. boat to Gaza, which is also another group in our coalition, from leaving port. And I just read a few hours ago that the French boat that was part of the flotilla, which was the only one to leave port, was actually detained by Israel and is currently being towed to Israel from international waters. So if Gaza, in the U.S. government's opinion, is only a humanitarian issue that's being dealt with and it's manageable, and if the overall blockade of the Gaza Strip is acceptable, and that therefore any political efforts to challenge that blockade are unacceptable, then a certain logic prevails that dictates that the United States would also work to prevent the international community from holding Israel accountable for its actions towards Gaza. But at least we can say that the Obama administration is consistent and logical in its approach to this issue. So if we look back, the first flotilla, which was attacked in international waters by Israel May 31st last year, in which 9 activists were killed, the UN Human Rights Council commissioned a report to look into Israel's attack on the flotilla. And the United States, at every step along the way, tried to undermine and object to the report and its mandate and its findings, and to try to prevent any actionable steps from being taken as regards to what it wrote. The UN Human Rights Council found, number one, that Israel's blockade of the Gaza Strip is illegal, that it constitutes an act of collective punishment that violates the Fourth Geneva Conventions. The Human Rights Council also found that because Israel's blockade of Gaza amounts to collective punishment and is illegal, attempts to enforce that blockade in international waters are also illegal. So its attack upon the flotilla was considered illegal under international law by the UN Human Rights Council. And it also found that in its attack on the flotilla last year, that Israel committed extrajudicial assassinations of 6 of the 9 passengers who were killed, and subjected the survivors to what the UN Human Rights Council called torture. Now, on September 28th of last year, Eileen Donahoe, who is a U.S. representative to the UN mission in Geneva, where the Human Rights Council meets, said, "We urge that this report not be used for actions that could disrupt the direct Israeli-Palestinian talks now underway, or actions that could make it harder for Israel and Turkey to move beyond the recent, quote, strains in their historically strong bilateral relationship." So you see here the rationale that's used is Israel cannot be held account for its actions. Israel cannot be held account to international law because that might harm the so-called peace process. And actually, if you look back further, this was the exact same rationale that the United States employed to undermine, object to, and reject the Goldstone report, which investigated cast lead, which Matthew referred to earlier, a 3-week attack on the Gaza Strip in which Israel killed 1,400 Palestinians, the vast majority civilians, destroyed 4,000 buildings, businesses, etc., and created billions of dollars worth of damage to Gaza's civilian infrastructure, which UNRWA is still trying to rebuild to this day. The Goldstone report found that both Israel and Palestinian armed groups, for that matter, in the course of this war, had committed violations of human rights, international law, war crimes, and possible crimes against humanity. Finally, after being badgered very strongly by a reporter, P.J. Crowley, the former State Department spokesperson, said in January 2011, when he was asked, "You didn't support the Goldstone report because you thought it would be, and then you thought that it turned out to be unfairly critical of Israel. Isn't that a fact?" So he was asked at a State Department briefing. He said, "Hey, all right, fine, but it has been borne out in terms of the effect that the Goldstone report at the time and subsequently had on our ability to move the parties into direct negotiation. That has had a material effect on the delay in getting the process started and has complicated our efforts over the past 2 years." So again, we see that the so-called peace process and the semblance and mirage of negotiations are used as an excuse for holding Israel to account for its actions, which perhaps ironically, perhaps not, is the exact same rationale that the Bush administration employed in urging the International Court of Justice not to hold Israel accountable for building its illegal apartheid wall in its landmark 2004 decision. The rationale was that there are talks underway and that therefore the International Court of Justice should not take up this issue. What makes U.S. policy under the Obama administration towards Gaza and towards Israel so atrocious is to take a step back and look to see how much actually worse it has gotten over the years. In 2005, the Bush administration brokered a now almost completely forgotten agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, which is called the Agreement on Movement and Access. You can find this text until today on the Israeli Foreign Ministry website. Here are a few things that Israel committed to do under U.S. aegis back in 2005. The intention of this accord was, quote, to facilitate the movement of goods and people within the Palestinian territories and to open, quote, an international crossing on the Gaza-Egypt border that will put the Palestinians in control of the entry and exit of people. This is what Israel committed to in 2005 and what the Bush administration helped to broker. Here's some other provisions in the AMA, and I think you know the answer based on Matt's presentation as to whether these criteria and these commitments that Israel made were fulfilled. Rafah will operate as soon as it is ready to operate at international standard. Rafah will also be used for the export of goods, which it's not currently being used for. The passages will operate continuously, and the number of trucks per day processed through Kearney will reach 400 by the end of 2006. Israel will permit the export of all agricultural products from Gaza. Israel will allow the passage of convoys to facilitate the movement of goods and people between Gaza and the West Bank. Consistent with security needs, Israel will facilitate the movement of people and goods within the West Bank to minimize disruption to Palestinian lives. And get this, The Gaza seaport construction can start, and the government of Israel will undertake to ensure donors that it will not interfere with the operation of the port. And discussions will continue on the issue of constructing and operating an airport into Gaza, which was previously demolished by Israel after it was built in part by U.S. taxpayer funds. So if you look back to this 2005 agreement brokered by the Bush administration and realize just how much U.S. policy towards Gaza has deteriorated since then under the Obama administration, the sad and one and only conclusion could be that if only the Obama administration would live up to the commitments of the Bush administration towards Israel and Gaza, we would be much better off than we are today, but of course still a long ways away from ending U.S. support for Israeli occupation and apartheid, which I'm convinced that we will together accomplish one day soon. Thank you very much.
Dr. Saeed, a retired surgeon. Mr. Matthew Reynolds, you talk about thousands of people going to schools. I'm not sure that you can produce jobs to employ all these thousands. So what are they doing? Are going to be school graduates unemployed, or some of them have to get out of Gaza and maybe go to the Arab world? There is a discrepancy between the number of students and the jobs you can create.
Oh, absolutely. That's going to be a huge problem, particularly when you contrast, and this is not just for Gaza, but in other places where UNRWA has schools and operates, you contrast essentially a very high literacy rate with a very high unemployment rate. You actually have a lot of young people that I think the UNRWA schools are doing a good job educating them, and there aren't the jobs. And this is a particular problem in Gaza. And while we do have some job creation programs, as I mentioned, UNRWA does, they're not the answer. The answer is allowing, if you have to allow for the free movement of goods and services and people. And that means lifting a blockade and opening the crossings. Gaza had a very profitable export industry. One of the job creation programs that UNRWA sponsors is a carnation plant where we grow carnation flowers, and they are exported out to mostly to Rotterdam, to the main market. The challenge that's faced, though, is that the Kerem Shalom crossing is not always open, and sometimes with the way that the crossings happen with the truck, particularly the refrigerated truck, and flowers, particularly in the hot sun, don't do all that well. So it's certainly, for the people who are working in the carnation farm, it's certainly an important source of income, and they're very excited about it, and they want it to continue, but it's essentially a subsidized program through aid, because you really can't get the flowers out very well. And that's across the board where there are problems. And that is one of the challenges. I mean, UNRWA, we have a works part of our mandate, and part of it is to help people get self-sustaining jobs. And the environment is such in Gaza that that's not happening. And it's the answer, as I said, is having a blockade lifted. Prior to the blockade, 120,000 Gazans crossed the lines every day to work in Israel. A lot of the businesses that are in Gaza, that you have very successful Western-oriented businessmen who are, into supply and demand and working well, have had many long-term and good relationships with Israeli firms. Prior to the closure of Gaza, a lot of Gazan products, agriculture and manufactured products, went out through the ports in Israel, and they had trading partners, and they went to the West Bank, and they went to Jordan. And unfortunately, that's just not happened. And you've seen these businesses. I met with a couple of the businessmen in Gaza City a month and a half ago who were saying, economically, it doesn't make sense for me to stay in Gaza. I'm Gazan, and my family and my roots are here, so I don't want it to die, so I'm going to stay and sort of subsidize the business. I'm profitable in other places with other businesses. But that's not a sustainable answer. And as I said, unfortunately, well, the answer is political, and UNRWA is not in a position to give political answers. But we are preparing, and we are optimistic and hopeful that there will be political answers, so that when a political answer happens, you actually have a well-educated, well-informed group of young men and women ready to join the workforce and ready to make better lives for themselves and not remain at the level of abject poverty that they're at.
Yes, ma'am, in the back.
My name is Susan Wilder. I'm the representative for Middle East policy for the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And for both of you, whoever would prefer to answer, my question has to do with the Palestinian Authority and what is their position on opening the Gaza-Israel crossings and the Gaza-Rafah crossing, and what, how helpful or unhelpful have they been in what you're trying to do?
I can't speak for the PA, but I am aware that they would very much like to see, obviously, not only Gaza, but some of the restrictions and roadblocks in areas they control in the West Bank also removed. You know, the real answer at the end of the day, when you take politics aside, you're going to have real success when you're able to have real economic development, and that means the free movement of goods and services and people. So again, I can't speak for them, but I believe from what I've seen in the press, they're obviously very in favor of opening, of having that movement and services. But as it is today, Palestinians in Gaza really can't visit their friends, relatives in the West Bank, and vice versa. And that's, we would like to see that alleviated, and I think they would too.
I'll just add in 2 points briefly. You know, we're always told by Israel and its supporters that Palestinians are violating their commitments under the Oslo Accords, and I think I outlined how Israel is not adhering to its obligations under a particular agreement it signed, and many more could be cited in that regard too. But if you look back to the original Oslo Accords signed in 1993, it's very specific that the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are to be treated as one integral territorial unit. That's the exact wording of the Oslo Accords. So, you know, the idea that Israel has and has had since at least 2005, since the unilateral withdrawal of settlers from the Gaza Strip, has been to disconnect the Gaza Strip from the West Bank and to make them two separate territorial entities without any ability to have any kind of normal human or economic contact between the two. So it's very much against the spirit of the agreements that the PLO signed with Israel, and the letter, for sure. And then just to add in, it's a very little known fact that the United States has a free trade agreement with the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. In 1984, the United States signed a free trade agreement with Israel. In the 1990s, that agreement was extended to also cover Palestinian products from the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So again, you have an absurd situation where the U.S. is complicit in helping Israel to blockade the Gaza Strip and going against the terms of the own free trade agreement that it has with Palestinians in the Gaza Strip to be able to freely export and import goods between Gaza and the United States. So it's really just, you know, a ludicrous situation all the way around, and certainly not in the spirit or letter of any of the agreements that have been signed.
Yes, sir.
Benjamin Tua. Despite all the dreary and awful statistics and information, both of you, if I understood you correctly, have expressed some optimism that the situation will change and improve. And I think that, Josh, you did this at the end of your statement, saying that you were hoping the blockade would be lifted, if I heard correctly. Could you give us the reasons for this guarded optimism?
I'd say that my personal optimism is much more than guarded. I'm actually very optimistic that the situation is, as President Obama has described, untenable, not only in relation to Gaza, but in relation to the whole collective structure that is Israeli occupation and apartheid towards Palestinians. I think it's crumbling. I think for 1,001 different reasons we're coming close to achieving a tipping point, and I think that it's really only a matter of time at this point. I do think that things could get very worse before they get better, as they did towards the end of apartheid in South Africa in the 1990s, when you had horrific levels of violence before an agreement was made to end apartheid rule there. So, you know, in the short term, it could get a lot worse, but in the medium term, I'm actually very optimistic, because you have this growing international boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, of which we are a part, and we actually just joined and contributed to a new global military embargo campaign against Israel, which was launched by the Palestinian National Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Committee, the Palestinian BNC. And we see these types of BDS campaigns growing and succeeding around the country. Today in Charlotte, North Carolina, TIAA-CREF, the financial giant, is holding its annual shareholder meeting, which is being dominated by questions of TIAA-CREF investing in corporations that are profiting from Israeli occupation and apartheid. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu wrote a very stunningly powerful op-ed in the Charlotte Observer on Sunday, I believe it was, in support of divestment from these Israeli corporations that are propping up and profiting from literally the system of occupation and apartheid. And so you have a situation where people like Israeli Defense Minister Ehud Barak have said that this BDS movement is like a glacier, a slow-moving glacier coming at us from all directions that we're powerless to stop. It's not actually slow-moving like a glacier. It's actually moving much more quickly than that, especially if you compare it to the analogous movement in South Africa to end apartheid. What took organizers decades to do to win BDS victories against the apartheid regime in South Africa is now taking organizations such as ours and the Palestinian BNC and all of its allies around the world years to do, or sometimes even less. And you have Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu coming to the United States saying that the top two existential threats to Israel today are, number one, nuclear weapons for Iran, and number two, this global boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Because clearly Israel is afraid that it is becoming isolated, that it's becoming a rogue regime in the eyes of the international community, and that it's growing increasingly isolated as a result. So in this kind of a situation, it can't be maintained forever, which is why I'm more optimistic than I've ever been that things will change for the better.
I mean, one always wants to be and should be optimistic, I think, for a number of reasons. I mean, the Palestinians are very resilient people. I will say, not speaking officially as UNRWA now, but it's just someone who was in Gaza and just walked with people and talked. I think there's two things, there are two trends, and they're very contradictory that I saw. Particularly among some of the older refugees, was an apathy setting in. It's just been so bad for so long, I'm just giving up. I'm just going to live this way, and, it's sort of the spirit and the spark is gone. Then I went to our schools. And then I see what's happening right now. UNRWA sponsors these huge summer games in Gaza, where most of the children participate in. It's a learning experience, but it's also an educational, a sports experience. Breaking a number of Guinness World Book records with kites and dribbling balls and parachute games, and UNRWA sponsored a marathon. And you see a new generation who, despite a lot of the challenges that they're facing, are looking very forward. I think they're receiving not only a good education. In the UNRWA schools, we are very committed to a human rights education. So there's a new class of youngsters coming out who, despite the challenges, again, are learning about civility and tolerance and looking ahead despite the challenges. And I think there's a lot of hope in that generation. I'm not counting out the older generation at all. I'm just saying I did see some of that, and there are other as it anywhere. Some, I guess it depends on if you look at this half full or half empty. But we're there to help prepare for that better future.
The man in the back, please.
Hi, Charles from Journal of Palestine Studies. I was just wondering if either of you could comment about why the numbers for Rafah have been kind of gone down to this, 450 a day kind of thing from the initial surge. Thanks.
Go ahead, Martin.
From what I understand, the Egyptian transition regime has put a lot of restrictions on who can leave Gaza and use the Rafah border crossing. I believe that there's pretty much a blanket prohibition against males 21 to 49, I think. So that cuts out a big percentage of the population who would use the crossing. But from what I understand, and maybe Matt knows better than I do, the actual numbers of people using the crossing are not substantially different from what they were before Egypt announced the supposed greater opening of the crossing?
Yeah, I guess all I could sort of say is, like everything in the Middle East, is connected to a lot of things. And looked at in a vacuum, you can always find a simple solution, but unfortunately, vacuum tubes are long gone, and we're in an age of everything being interconnected. So I think there's probably multiple issues there. It's not a large crossing. I mean, if for those of you who may have ever seen it, it's not. Some of the crossing points, Kerem Shalom is a big construction and big goods processing with large areas for big flatbed trucks and so on. Even the Eretz crossing in northern Israel looks like a modern airline terminal with lots of gates and lots of ways to go through. And I've seen Rafah from both the Egyptian side and from the Gaza side, or the Rafah city side, if you will, and split city. But it's not imposing. It's not like, oh, here's this huge crossing. It sort of reminds me of something you would have seen in the 50s or 60s, some little sandstone type building with a gate that opens, and it's not. I may be missing something. I didn't cross through it, but it's certainly not like some of the other real crossings that go into Israel from Gaza, where you really have heavy infrastructure. Carney and now being built at Kerem Shalom is, for example, a conveyor belt, so that you have feed for animals as well as rock and cement, literally going over these large conveyor belts, something you probably see at a big American mega farm out in Nebraska. So it's some size differences there too.
Yes, sir.
Norman Bright, Counsel for the National Interest. Is UNRWA going to try and work with the Egyptian transition regime or whatever comes to fruition after the elections to develop the Rafah Crossing into something suitable for importing more goods, or will that jeopardize your relationship with Israel to use those?
No, we have agreements primarily with Israel. Our crossing points, again, just infrastructurally, go through the infrastructure's there. We'd like to see more of it utilized. For example, Carney and so far are both openings that we would like to see used, as well as Kerem Shalom. And we're not. That's really a political decision, and there's a lot of things that could happen in the future that who knows what the world brings to us. But UNRWA maintains good relations with Egypt. It's an important partner. It's the home of the Arab League. We actually have a small office in Egypt to deal directly with the Egyptians and the Arab League. But our concentration is trying to get as many goods and things through the established areas that we have, and we do have a complicated but working relationship with the Israeli military. To get these materials in from Israel into Gaza for building a school, it's very similar, or perhaps even more detailed than when I used to work at the State Department than you'd see in a arms export control license, where certainly there's no question where every bag of cement is going because it's tracked. So it's a complicated and expensive process, but we're hoping over time it's improved. We always work with the Israelis to see if we can improve it and improve speed and so on. But even there, sometimes technical problems are easy to resolve, but they may be associated with a larger political issue. And if you leave it to the two engineers, they always can find a good and easy way. But unfortunately, like everything in the Middle East, it's not always up to the engineers to decide these things.
This man right there, please.
Thank you. I have a very simple question. I assumed, or I thought, mistakenly perhaps, that the Rafah crossing was essentially a tunnel. Is that correct?
No, there are two. There's two issues around Rafah. You may have read in the press and seen there are quite a few tunnels that go under the Rafah crossing, and that is where what they call the tunnel and an informal economy comes from. These are the smugglers who bring in all kinds of things through the tunnels. There's an official crossing, an official Rafah crossing, which I sort of described, the smaller thing with the black iron gates, that is between Gaza and Egypt, and that was the result of negotiations between Israel and Egypt. But there certainly are quite a few tunnels you can probably find in the press pictures or so on of literally underground tunnels under that wall that exists there.
Can I just add in that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, I don't know if the project is still going on or if it's finished, but at one point about a year and a half ago, I think it was, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers with quote-unquote U.S. economic aid decided to build a steel wall, I believe 30 feet down into the ground to try to cut off these tunnels. And I think because of the revolution in Egypt, I don't know, well, maybe you know, Matt, if that project was ever completed, but the U.S. was trying actively to cut off those tunnels.
I don't know. I think the only thing I would comment on is that the tunnels themselves are not all that safe. So there's a better answer to tunnels, and it's improving the crossings that are official and open and have already been built. And UNRWA would like to see much more free movement of trade and people. And then there wouldn't be the dependency on a tunnel.
Was that the Obama administration?
The question was whether it was the Obama administration that had approved funding for the steel wall to cut off the tunnels. Yes.
Any last questions? Okay, thank you very much for coming. Thank you.